Woman eaten alive by a lion returns with a shocking warning from Jesus. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale, orange hue over the savannah. The vast, open plains stretched as far as the eye could see, broken only by the occasional acacia tree standing like solitary sentinels in the endless grass. A gentle breeze stirred the tall, dry grass, and the faint sounds of wildlife filled the air. The serenity of the morning was almost deceptive, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just hours earlier. Sarah lay motionless in the dirt, her once vibrant red dress now stained with dark splotches of blood. Her body was torn and mangled, a horrific testament to the violent encounter she had just survived. Her limbs, twisted unnaturally beneath her, were bruised and battered, but it wasn't the physical damage that had people talking. It was the fact that she had survived at all. No one could understand how she had made it through the attack. The lion's claws and teeth had ravaged her body, its powerful jaws tearing into her flesh with an intensity that should have left her lifeless. It had been a miracle, or perhaps a curse, that she had survived the mauling. But no one could account for how she managed to escape the animal's grasp or what had kept her alive long enough to be rescued. The very idea of someone being alive after such an attack seemed incomprehensible. And yet, here she was, lying in the dirt, breathing, somehow still alive, and the look on her face, pale and drawn, suggested that she had seen things that no one should ever see. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, her vision blurred as her senses struggled to make sense of the world around her. The sounds of the savannah seemed muffled, as though she were submerged in water. She felt detached from her own body, the pain barely registering against the overwhelming weight of her exhaustion. Every inch of her felt raw, as though every fiber of her being had been stretched to its breaking point. She tried to speak, to call out, but the words lodged in her throat, leaving her gasping for air as her chest constricted. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts, her lungs burning as she struggled to take in enough oxygen to keep herself conscious. The darkness around her seemed to close in, the edges of her vision blurring and fading. And then, through the haze, she saw him. A figure appeared before her, his presence calm yet powerful. The figure was dressed in simple robes, a serene, almost otherworldly glow emanating from his form. Sarah's eyes focused on him, but even as she recognized him, a part of her couldn't believe what she was seeing. He stood before her, his face compassionate yet full of authority. The air around him seemed to shimmer, as if he were not entirely of this world. Sarah, the voice was soft but carried an undeniable weight, like the deep reverberation of a distant bell. She struggled to comprehend what was happening, the events of the attack, the overwhelming pain, everything colliding in a haze of confusion. "Jesus," Sarah whispered, barely able to form the words, her voice raspy and weak. She could hardly believe her eyes. Was this a hallucination? Had the trauma driven her mad? Or was this truly the man she had heard of only in stories? "Yes, Sarah," Jesus replied, his voice calming and soothing, yet there was a palpable urgency in it that made her heart race. "It is me. You have been chosen. You have seen what few ever have. You have crossed to the other side and returned, and now you must understand why." Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. She could barely comprehend what he was saying. Chosen? Crossed to the other side? Her mind raced back to the attack, the lion's powerful jaws, the blood, the searing pain. She had felt the life slipping from her body, the darkness closing in, and then, nothing. How had she returned from the brink of death? How could she still be here? "But I don't understand," Sarah gasped, trying to sit up, her body fighting against her, too weak to comply. I don't remember anything after." She couldn't finish the sentence. The memory was too painful, too fresh. "You don't need to remember," Jesus answered, his tone both gentle and firm. "What you saw, what you experienced, is not for you alone. You were given a gift, but it is not just for your understanding. It is for all of humanity." The words didn't make sense to her. She had come so close to death, and now she was being told she had been given some kind of gift? The pieces weren't coming together. How could she possibly be of any importance now, after everything she had just been through? "You were chosen to witness the truth," Jesus continued, his voice unwavering. The truth of what lies beyond the veil. The truth of what is coming. Your time is not yet over, Sarah. Your survival, your return, is not an accident. It is a warning. A warning? Her chest tightened, a wave of panic washing over her as she tried to make sense of his words. The world seemed to tilt as she looked at him, unsure if she could trust her own mind. But there was something about him, something in the deep, knowing gaze he fixed on her, that made her feel like everything she had endured had a purpose. "What do I need to do?" Sarah managed to croak, her voice barely above a whisper. What am I supposed to do?" Jesus smiled softly, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and compassion. "Listen carefully, Sarah. What you are about to witness will change everything. The world you knew, the world you lived in, is not the world it seems. There are things hidden from view, things that will soon come to light. And you are the one who will deliver the warning. You must make them understand. The time is near." The words were heavy with meaning, but they were also filled with dread. The air around her felt colder suddenly, and the sense of foreboding that filled the room made her heart race faster. There was a heaviness to everything, an impending doom she could barely grasp, yet she knew deep down that it was real. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, Jesus turned away, the glow around him dimming. "Be strong, Sarah. Your journey is just beginning. You must tell them before it is too late." With that, the vision of Jesus disappeared, and Sarah was left alone again, her body aching from the trauma. The darkness that had once seemed so welcoming now felt like an uninvited guest. The weight of his words lingered in her mind, the terrifying warning echoing in her thoughts. She was alive. But what did that truly mean? Sarah struggled to keep her focus, the weight of the vision lingering like a shroud over her thoughts. She had barely survived the attack, her body a twisted mess of pain and exhaustion. The lion's claws, its fangs, she could still feel the phantom ache of them tearing into her flesh. She could still hear the growl of the beast, its guttural, predatory breath. Yet here she was, alive, breathing, even after the horror she had endured. But the question that gnawed at her relentlessly was, why? She had no answers. Only questions. So many questions. As the sun climbed higher, its light harsh and unforgiving, Sarah shifted in her makeshift bed, a cot in a sterile hospital room that felt so far removed from the savannah where she had been attacked. The smell of antiseptic filled her nose, the steady beep of machines surrounding her in a rhythmic reminder of her fragile existence. The doctors had done their best, they said. They had saved her life. Yet there was no amount of medical expertise that could restore what had been taken from her, what had been seen. Sarah closed her eyes, her mind unwillingly drifting back to that moment when the lion's jaws had closed around her. She remembered the pain, the blood, the helplessness. But beyond that, she remembered the dark, the nothingness that had enveloped her, as if the very essence of her being had been swallowed up by the world itself. And then Jesus, the figure who had appeared in the midst of her torment, offering her cryptic words that made her feel as if she had been pulled from the depths of something far worse than death. "The time is near," she whispered under her breath, her voice trembling. She couldn't shake the words from her mind. "The time is near." She shifted, her body sore from the various wounds, but a new kind of restlessness was creeping up inside her, stronger than the physical pain. A gnawing fear was beginning to take root deep within her chest, something far worse than the fear of death. She could feel it, crawling beneath her skin, as if some unseen force was pushing her toward something, toward someone. The hospital room, despite its coldness, began to feel suffocating. The walls, which had once provided a sense of safety, now felt oppressive, as though the very air in the room was closing in around her. A vague unease wrapped itself around her heart, tightening with every passing minute. What if she couldn't make sense of the message? What if Jesus had meant something else? What if the warning was something she couldn't even begin to understand? But she wasn't alone. Through the haze of her thoughts, she heard a sound, a faint, distant rustle. At first, she thought it was just a trick of her exhausted mind, her senses heightened by the trauma she had endured. But then the sound came again, closer this time. She opened her eyes, her breath catching in her throat as she tried to focus on the shadows creeping around the edge of her bed. "Sarah?" A voice whispered, barely audible, but so familiar. It was the voice of her sister, Karen. The voice that had once comforted her during difficult times, the voice that had always been there. But this time, it didn't sound comforting at all. The tone was different, low and urgent, as if something terrible was happening just beyond her reach. "Sarah, please." The voice seemed to echo through the room, becoming more insistent, more strained with each word. It sent a ripple of panic through Sarah's already fragile nerves. She could feel her heart rate quicken as she struggled to sit up, her limbs heavy and uncooperative. She reached for the call button beside her bed, but before her fingers could touch it, the door to the room creaked open. Karen stepped in, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and dread. But as she entered the room, Sarah could see something else in her expression. A sort of unease, a fear that didn't belong. "Karen?" Sarah whispered, her voice cracking as she stared at her sister. Karen didn't speak immediately. Instead, she just stood there, watching Sarah, her eyes filled with a strange mix of sorrow and apprehension. The silence between them felt thick, like a heavy fog that neither of them could escape. Finally, Karen spoke, her voice low, barely more than a whisper. "Sarah? I don't know how to say this, but I think something's happening." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The words didn't make sense to her at first. Something's happening? What did that mean? She had been through so much already. How could anything else possibly happen now? Karen hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously to the door, as if to make sure no one else was listening. "I've been hearing things, strange things, voices." Sarah felt a chill run through her, her breath quickening. "Voices? What do you mean?" Karen took a deep breath, then let it out slowly, as if she were trying to steady herself before continuing. "They're calling you, Sarah. They're calling you, and I don't know if it's real. But I've heard it. It's the same voice. The one that you heard." Sarah's stomach lurched, her mind reeling as she pieced the words together. "What voice?" she asked, her voice rising in panic. "What do you mean? What's going on?" Karen stepped closer, her face pale, her hands trembling as they reached out towards Sarah. "It's Jesus. I've been hearing him too." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, knocking the breath out of her. She stared at her sister, unable to speak, as the weight of the revelation sank in. Could it be true? Was Karen hearing the same thing she had? The same warning, the same message? But before Sarah could process anything further, the lights in the room flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. She felt an unsettling presence fill the space, a pressure that made it hard to breathe, as if something was closing in on her from all sides. "No," Karen whispered, taking a step back. "This isn't right." The room seemed to tilt. Everything around them felt wrong. Sarah's heart pounded against her ribs as she stared at Karen, her sister's words hanging in the air like an unspoken threat. The room felt unnervingly still, but the oppressive tension was rising with each passing second. She could barely make sense of what Karen had said, the weight of the words crashing down on her like a tidal wave. "Jesus?" Sarah repeated, her voice hoarse and trembling. "You've been hearing his voice too?" Karen nodded, her eyes wide with fear, her face pale. "I don't know what's happening. I just know I've been hearing him, calling us. It's the same voice. The same words you heard, Sarah." The lights flickered again, their buzzing hum filling the silence between them. Sarah could feel the temperature in the room drop, the air growing thick and cold, as though the walls themselves were closing in on them. The chill ran through her, sinking deep into her bones, and she shivered despite herself. Her mind was reeling, trying to piece together the impossible. How could Karen be hearing the same thing? How could she be hearing the voice of Jesus, just like Sarah had, after everything she had gone through? The lion's attack, the darkness, the encounter with the figure who had warned her, none of it made sense. It was all too much. "I don't understand," Sarah murmured, her hands clutching the sides of her bed, the cold sweat slicking her palms. "Why now? Why are we hearing this? Why me? Why us?" Karen's eyes darted nervously around the room, her lips trembling as she spoke. It's like we're being chosen. But I don't know for what. I don't know if it's good or if it's bad. I can't make sense of it, Sarah. All I know is I feel like something is coming. Something we're supposed to do, or something that's going to happen." The weight of Karen's words hit Sarah like a freight train. The atmosphere around them felt heavier now, the air thick with an impending sense of doom. Sarah's breath became shallow as she looked around the room, her eyes locking onto the walls, the ceiling, the door. Everything seemed to be closing in on her. The shadows were growing longer, stretching further, as though they were reaching for her. The presence in the room was undeniable now, something far beyond her understanding, beyond her control. It was suffocating, unrelenting. And even though she had no answers, Sarah knew that the visions, the voices, were just the beginning. There was something darker looming in the distance. Karen's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. "Sarah, I can't take this anymore. It's too much. I feel like I'm being watched, like there's something following me, watching every move I make." Her voice faltered. "It's like we're connected now, like we're being led towards something. I don't know if I'm ready for whatever it is." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat as she listened to her sister's words. She had felt the same unease, the same fear, deep in her chest. The terror had started before, when the lion had attacked, but now, it had grown into something else entirely. It was no longer just the physical horror she had endured, but something intangible, something spiritual. Something she couldn't outrun or escape. The room seemed to get smaller, the walls pressing in on them, the ceiling low and oppressive. Sarah's thoughts began to spiral. Had she been brought back for a reason? Could it be true? Could she really be part of something greater, something that had transcended her near-death experience? "Karen," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Do you think, could this be real? What if it's not just in our heads? What if it's—" The sound of something scraping against the floor outside the room broke her off. Her breath caught in her throat as she froze, her eyes wide with terror. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like something, or someone, was moving through the hallway just beyond the door. Karen's face paled as she grabbed Sarah's hand, squeezing it tightly, her voice barely a whisper. "Sarah, I'm scared. I've been hearing strange things. Last night I heard footsteps outside my room, and then a whisper. It was too quiet to make out, but I swear it sounded like a voice, like someone was speaking to me. It wasn't the voice we've been hearing. It was different." The tension in the room thickened as the sound grew louder. It wasn't just the occasional scrape of footsteps anymore. Now it was unmistakable, a slow, heavy thump, followed by the unmistakable sound of breathing, ragged, heavy, as though something was watching them. "Shoo," Sarah whispered, her heart hammering in her chest as she listened. The sound was coming closer now, each step seeming louder and more deliberate than the last. She could feel the air grow colder still, a bone-chilling breeze slipping under the door, stirring the papers on the bedside table. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah held her breath, her eyes fixed on the door, her heart racing in her chest. The room was still too still. It felt as though the entire world had paused, waiting, holding its breath. "What do you think it is?" Karen whispered, her voice trembling as she stared at the door. "What's happening, Sarah?" Before Sarah could answer, the lights flickered. Then they went out completely. The darkness that consumed the room was absolute, suffocating, as if the very air had been drained from it. Sarah could feel her pulse quicken, her breath shallow, as the oppressive weight of the silence returned, wrapping around her like a blanket of dread. And then, from somewhere deep in the dark, she heard it. The faintest whisper. A voice, soft and distant. "Sarah?" The whisper seemed to hover in the dark, so quiet, so faint, that Sarah almost convinced herself she had imagined it. But then it came again, this time sharper, more insistent, as if trying to pierce the veil of silence that had consumed the room. "Sarah?" Her breath caught in her throat, a cold sweat breaking out across her skin. She turned to Karen, who was clutching her arm, her face pale, eyes wide with terror. Neither of them had made a sound, yet the voice persisted, distant and muffled but unmistakable. It was a voice that felt too close, too intimate, as though it was coming from inside the very walls around them. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Karen nodded, her gaze flicking nervously toward the door. "I heard it too. But what is it?" Before Sarah could respond, there was a sudden loud bang from the hallway, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and slow. The weight of each step sent a ripple of fear through Sarah's body, as if something was stalking them just beyond the door. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, every inch of her skin tingling with the sensation that they were being watched, hunted. She didn't know how long the footsteps continued, maybe it was minutes or maybe hours, but time seemed to stretch, thick and slow, as the tension in the room mounted with each passing second. The oppressive silence that followed felt like a vacuum, pulling at her chest, making it hard to breathe. Suddenly, the door handle rattled. Sarah's breath hitched. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. Her entire body was frozen in fear, her eyes fixed on the door as it slowly creaked open, the sound of it scraping against the floor louder than it should have been. The darkness on the other side seemed to reach toward them, pulling them into its depths. From the shadows beyond the door, a figure emerged. It was a man, but not just any man. The way he moved was almost unnatural, like he was not quite part of this world. His features were shadowed, his face hidden in the dim light, but there was an unsettling familiarity to him, something about his presence that felt too real, too purposeful. The air grew colder the closer he came, the temperature dropping with each step. Sarah felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, her body screaming for her to flee, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. She could sense that whatever this man was, he was connected to everything, connected to the voices, the warning, the fear that had taken over her life since the attack. "Who are you?" Sarah found her voice, but it was barely a whisper, as if speaking louder would shatter the fragile hold on reality she still had. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took another slow, deliberate step toward her. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as he closed the gap, his presence overwhelming, suffocating her. There was something wrong about him, something deep within the pit of her stomach that told her he was not human. And then, without warning, his eyes locked onto hers. His gaze was piercing, like a blade cutting through the darkness. The look in his eyes was not kind. It wasn't reassuring. It was cold, calculating, filled with something ancient and malevolent. "Sarah?" he said, his voice low and guttural, like the growl of something animalistic, something that had existed long before mankind had ever walked the earth. "It's too late to change the course of what's coming. The warning has been given, and you are the vessel." Sarah's stomach churned. The words hit her like a slap, her body recoiling from their weight. Vessel? What was he talking about? She wanted to speak, to demand answers, but her throat felt tight, the words stuck there like shards of glass. Karen was beside her now, her hand gripping Sarah's arm as she tried to steady herself. "What does he mean? What warning?" Karen whispered, her voice shaking with fear. The man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Sarah's face. The air around him seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if it were alive and pressing in on them. He didn't need to say another word. His presence, his sheer being, was enough to tell Sarah that whatever was coming, whatever had been set in motion, was beyond her comprehension. His lips curled into a slow, predatory smile, and in that moment, Sarah knew. The warning was not just about her survival. It was about something bigger, something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. She had crossed into something that couldn't be undone. There was no turning back. "You will see the truth soon enough," the man said cryptically, his voice like ice scraping across stone. "And when you do, you will understand. The world you once knew is gone. What you are about to witness, it is the reckoning." The words hung in the air, and for the briefest of moments, Sarah could have sworn she felt the ground beneath her feet tremble, as though something massive, something powerful, was moving beneath the surface. The world felt different now, shifted, unbalanced. The very fabric of her reality was cracking at the seams. Just as quickly as he had appeared, the figure turned and began to walk toward the door. But before he left, he spoke one final time, his voice carrying a haunting certainty that made Sarah's blood run cold. "You can't escape it. None of you can." With that, the figure stepped into the darkness beyond the door, and the room was plunged into an unnatural silence once again. Sarah and Karen stood frozen, their bodies still, their minds reeling. What had just happened? Who was that man? What did he mean by the reckoning? And how was Sarah supposed to prepare for something like that? As the silence dragged on, Sarah felt a shiver crawl up her spine. The world outside might have seemed still, but she could feel it now, a shift, an undercurrent of something terrible moving in the distance. Something was coming, and they were standing in its path. The room felt cold, too cold. Even with the warmth of the morning sun trying to break through the thin hospital curtains, the chill in the air was unbearable, almost suffocating. The silence between Sarah and Karen was heavier than it should have been, the weight of the stranger's words hanging like a dark cloud over them. Sarah could barely move, her limbs stiff from both the trauma she had endured and the intense fear that had rooted her in place. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, her mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. The man, whatever he was, had come, said those cryptic words, and left, leaving behind an air of dread that refused to dissipate. "Karen," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, as if speaking louder would make the fear too real. Her eyes never left the door, which remained ajar, the shadows beyond it seeming to press inward as if the room itself were trying to consume her. Do you think this is real?" What he said. Karen didn't answer immediately. Instead, she just stood there, her face pale and her eyes wide with the same terror that had gripped Sarah. The expression on Karen's face was one of pure disbelief, her thoughts racing as she tried to process the events of the past few hours. Sarah could see it in her sister's eyes, the fear of something she couldn't control, something far bigger than either of them. The sense that they were on the edge of something terrible, and no matter how hard they tried to resist, they would be pulled into it. "I don't know," Karen finally whispered, her voice strained. "But I think we have no choice but to listen." She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "It's like we're being dragged into something, whether we want to be or not." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. The dread that had taken root in her heart seemed to grow with each word. She couldn't explain it, but she knew. The presence of the man, the dark energy that had filled the room, had shaken something deep within her. Something that made her feel that the world she knew, the world she had survived in, was no longer the world she would live in. Everything had changed, and she couldn't stop it. Her eyes darted to the small window, the light from outside barely piercing the thick, oppressive air inside the room. The outside world seemed distant, unreachable. The sounds of life beyond the hospital walls were muted, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting. The silence between them grew longer, the weight of it pressing down on Sarah's chest, suffocating her as her thoughts spiraled into darker places. She could feel it, a pull like a current beneath the surface, dragging her towards something she wasn't ready to face. But the more she resisted, the stronger it became. The warning had been clear. The reckoning was coming, and they had been chosen to bear witness. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered. Once, twice, before going completely dark. The sudden absence of light, the loss of the comforting hum of the overhead bulbs, made Sarah's heart race. She strained her eyes to see in the darkness, but nothing moved. The darkness seemed to press in on them, a living entity determined to swallow them whole. "Sarah," Karen's voice broke the silence, shaky with fear. "What is happening?" Sarah couldn't answer. She didn't have an explanation for any of it. She only knew that it felt wrong. The room felt wrong. The air, the silence, the shadows, they were all closing in, suffocating them. And then, through the darkness, she heard something. A faint, distant sound, like a low, rumbling growl, barely audible but undeniable. It started as a faint vibration, a hum at the edge of her hearing, but as the seconds stretched into eternity, it grew louder, more distinct. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from beneath the very foundation of the room. Her stomach dropped. The sound was familiar, too familiar. It was the same rumble she had heard in the savannah, moments before the lion had attacked. That guttural growl, that predatory sound that had heralded the end of everything she knew. "What is that?" Karen whispered, her voice barely audible, but the terror was clear in every syllable. Before Sarah could respond, the sound intensified. The growl grew louder, deeper, filling the room, vibrating through the walls and the floor beneath them. It wasn't just an animal. This wasn't just the sound of a lion. It was something else. Something unnatural. The room itself seemed to tremble under the weight of the sound, the walls creaking, the air thickening with the oppressive energy that had begun to fill the space. The door slammed shut. Sarah and Karen jumped, the sound reverberating through the room, making the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. The room was now completely dark, and the eerie hum from outside had stopped. But the feeling of dread, of something pulling at the very fabric of reality, had only intensified. "What is going on?" Karen gasped, her hand gripping Sarah's arm tightly, her fingers digging into her skin. "What is happening to us, Sarah?" But Sarah couldn't answer. She could barely breathe. The weight in her chest was suffocating her, and the growling sound, that rumbling vibration, was so close now it felt like it was inside the walls, inside her very bones. She could feel it vibrating through her skin, through her heart, as though everything around her was about to crack open. And then, suddenly, a voice. Not a whisper. Not the figure of the man from before. But a voice that filled the space, powerful, commanding, and unmistakably familiar. "You cannot escape the truth." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was the same voice she had heard before, the same one that had warned her, that had called her into this reality. But this time, it was different. This time, it was stronger. The room began to swirl. The darkness became deeper, thicker, like the very air was being sucked from her lungs. The vibrations intensified, the ground beneath her feet seeming to shift. The world was breaking apart. The warning was here, and there was no escape. The air in the room had become suffocating, thick with a presence Sarah couldn't explain. Her chest tightened with every breath, as if the very act of breathing was pulling her deeper into a nightmare she couldn't escape. The voice, that deep, resonant voice that had filled the space, reverberated in her mind, drowning out everything else. "You cannot escape the truth." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, and she tried to steady her breath, but the fear was overwhelming. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in around her as the air thickened, heavy with something other. There was no light now, no comfort to be found in the safety of her hospital room. It had become a trap, an inescapable cage. She turned to Karen, who was still beside her, her grip on Sarah's arm unyielding. The fear in Karen's eyes mirrored Sarah's own, but there was something else there too, a growing understanding that whatever was happening was beyond their control. It was as if they had crossed a line, entered a realm where they were no longer just witnesses to some event, but active participants in something much larger, much darker. "What is it?" Karen gasped, her voice barely a whisper, trembling with panic. "What is happening, Sarah?" But Sarah had no answers. She had no explanations for the madness unfolding around them. She could feel it, feel the presence that was now in the room with them. It wasn't just a feeling, it was palpable, like a weight pressing down on her, suffocating her with its intensity. Every part of her screamed to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The room, the world, it felt like it was closing in on them. They were trapped in something that wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. The forces at play were beyond human comprehension, beyond anything Sarah could have imagined. The rumbling growl from before started again, louder this time, almost deafening. It was no longer distant. It was here, inside the room, inside her. The growl was the sound of something massive, something primal. It was the sound of a creature, a beast, closing in on them, but not just any animal. This was something more. Something that transcended flesh and bone. The growl wasn't coming from a lion anymore. It was coming from the walls, from the very air, from the depths of something darker than Sarah had ever known. "What is that?" Karen whimpered, her eyes wide with terror. "What's happening to us?" Sarah could feel her mind beginning to fracture under the pressure, the noise, the relentless pounding of her heartbeat in her ears. Her hands shook violently, and she clutched at the sides of her bed for support, but the world around her seemed to shift in and out of focus. The room had become an alien space, unfamiliar and hostile. The shadows stretched unnaturally, the flickering of the lights above her adding to the disorienting sensation that she was caught between two realities, two worlds. And then the voice came again. This time, it was not a whisper. It was louder, clearer, and it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. You are the chosen ones. The reckoning will begin soon. The time has come for you to witness the truth. Sarah's stomach dropped as the words sank in. The truth. The reckoning. She couldn't wrap her mind around it, couldn't understand what it all meant, but she knew, deep down, in the very marrow of her bones, that whatever was about to unfold was going to shatter everything she understood about the world. Karen trembled beside her, her face pale as she looked desperately toward the door. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They were alive, writhing, reaching for them. The air was thick with a heavy energy that made every movement feel sluggish, like they were wading through tar. The hospital room, the once safe, sterile environment, had become a chamber of horrors. A place where reality and nightmare were blending, indistinguishable. What are we supposed to do? Karen whispered, her voice trembling. How can we stop it? But Sarah didn't have an answer. She could feel the words of the voice echoing in her head, pounding through her skull like a drumbeat. The reckoning will begin soon. The truth. She felt the weight of it, the inevitability of it, like a massive tidal wave, crashing toward them. They were powerless against it. Suddenly, the air shifted again. The pressure grew more intense, more suffocating, as if the very room was being sucked into something larger, something beyond their control. The shadows grew deeper, darker, curling like tendrils around them. And through it all, that low, rumbling growl continued, relentless and insistent. Sarah? The whisper came again, but this time, it wasn't from the figure they had seen earlier. It wasn't from the man or the voice of Jesus. It was different. This voice was familiar, but twisted. Sarah's blood ran cold as she recognized it. It was her own voice. She turned to look at Karen, her face a mask of confusion and fear. "What?" she whispered. But before Karen could respond, she heard it again. The voice. "Sarah, help me. I'm trapped. I can't escape." It was coming from somewhere inside the room, but it didn't feel like it was coming from the walls, from the air. This voice was inside her. It was her own voice, but not her. It sounded hollow, distorted, like an echo of something far darker. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she looked down at her hands. They were shaking violently, her fingers twitching as though something was trying to claw its way out from deep within her. The room seemed to spin, the walls pressing in, the air thick and suffocating. She gasped for air, but it felt like there was no oxygen left in the room. "Sarah," the voice repeated, louder this time, filling her head. "You can't hide from what you've done. The reckoning is already here." Karen screamed as the shadows seemed to close in on them, engulfing them in absolute darkness. The room had become a tomb. The walls were closing in, and the ground beneath them felt as though it were shifting. The whispers, the growls, the voice, it all became a cacophony, drowning them in sound, in terror. And then there was a flash. A blinding light that filled the room with a force that knocked both women to the ground. The light that had burst into the room was blinding, too bright, searing through the darkness like a knife. For a moment, Sarah felt as though she was being pulled into the very light itself, her body weightless, her senses stretched and strained under the intense pressure. The light was all around her, swallowing everything in its path, leaving nothing but an overwhelming sense of vertigo, of being torn from one place and thrust into another. The world had shifted again. As suddenly as the light appeared, it vanished, leaving nothing but a stifling silence in its wake. The pressure on Sarah's chest, the suffocating feeling that had taken over the room, had lifted, but only slightly. The room was still dark, but there was a different quality to it now, a sense of waiting, of anticipation. It felt as though something had changed, something fundamental, something deep. Sarah blinked, trying to adjust her eyes to the new, strange atmosphere. Her surroundings were dim, but she could make out faint outlines of familiar shapes. Her hospital bed, the window, the door, but it was as though they were muted, as if she were seeing them through a fogged-up glass. The room had the same walls, the same floor, the same familiar setup, but it felt alien now. The air was thick, heavy with something she couldn't describe, something that made the hairs on her arms stand at attention. She glanced over at Karen, who was still lying on the floor, her face a mask of fear and confusion. Her sister's eyes were wide, her lips trembling as she slowly sat up, shaking her head as if to clear it from the shock. She looked as though she were trying to grasp the reality of what had just occurred. "What happened?" Karen whispered, her voice hoarse, her breath shallow. "What was that?" Sarah opened her mouth to answer, but her throat was dry, her voice barely a whisper. The words didn't come out right. She didn't have an answer. She didn't know what had just happened. The light, the growl, the whispers, the presence, everything was a blur now, tangled together into something incomprehensible. But as she tried to gather her thoughts, the room seemed to grow colder once again. A biting chill swept through the space, cutting through the thin layers of fabric that covered her. Her breath became visible in the air, misting in front of her face, but Karen hadn't noticed. She was staring at the door, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Sarah?" Karen's voice was trembling, her face pale with fear. "Do you see that?" Sarah turned to look at the door, but for a moment, it felt like her mind was playing tricks on her. It was as if the world was tilting again, the edges of reality warping in ways she couldn't explain. But then she saw it. The faintest shimmer. A ripple in the air, like heat rising from the pavement on a hot summer day. The door was no longer just a door. It was becoming something else, something fluid, shifting, distorting as if it were a gateway to another realm. And then she heard it. A voice. Not the comforting, familiar voice of Jesus, but something else, something much darker. It came from behind the door, faint but unmistakable. The growling sound, that same guttural rumble from earlier, reverberated through the walls again, echoing through Sarah's chest like an unholy vibration. "You cannot hide from what you have unleashed." The words were deep, rich with malice, and they hung in the air like an omen. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she turned to Karen, her eyes wide with terror. There was something in the room with them, something powerful, something that was drawing closer. "What is that?" Karen gasped, her voice rising with panic. "What's happening?" Sarah didn't have time to answer. The presence behind the door was growing stronger, louder, until it seemed as though it was coming from all around them. The walls vibrated with the force of it, the growl growing deeper, more pronounced. It was as though the very room itself was alive, twisting and warping under the weight of whatever was approaching. The door seemed to shift again, its shape bending and buckling as though it were made of something more than wood and steel. Sarah could barely comprehend what she was seeing. The world around them had become an inescapable nightmare. And then the door burst open. But it wasn't the door that shocked them. It was what came through it. A figure. Tall, cloaked in shadow, with eyes that glowed like burning embers. The figure stepped into the room, and with every movement, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. A cold wind swept through the space, swirling like a storm as the figure stood there, its presence a crushing weight against Sarah's chest. The man, if it could even be called a man, towered over them. His face was obscured by the shadows, but Sarah could feel his gaze, cold and judgmental, penetrating her soul. This wasn't the voice of Jesus. This wasn't any savior. This was something else, something ancient and malevolent. "You've crossed a line, Sarah. There's no going back." The words were filled with venom, dripping with disdain. Sarah could barely move, her body frozen in place as the figure's eyes locked onto hers. She could feel the weight of its gaze, as though it were reading her very soul. "You thought you could escape the truth. But you were wrong." The figure stepped closer, its eyes glowing brighter with each movement. Sarah wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat. She wanted to run, to escape, but her feet felt like they were cemented to the floor. She was trapped. "You have no choice but to face the consequences of your actions." The figure extended a hand, long fingers curling toward her like claws, its presence growing stronger, suffocating her. The walls seemed to close in around her, the air thick with a force she couldn't fight, couldn't push away. The very room seemed to tremble with the weight of the figure's presence. "This is only the beginning," The figure's voice was a low growl, sending a shiver through Sarah's spine. "You are the key to what is coming, and you will not be spared." Before Sarah could even react, the figure stepped forward, its hand reaching for her. The cold in the room intensified, and as it touched her, everything went black. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the darkness gave way. A single, blinding light pierced the void, a beacon in the infinite black. Sarah felt a force, gentle yet unyielding, pull her toward the light. She couldn't explain it, but she felt the grip of something familiar, something comforting. Her body began to stabilize, her senses coming back to her as she was drawn closer and closer to the light. As she moved through the space, the cold receded, replaced by a warmth she hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. The oppressive weight that had hung over her lifted, and the air grew clearer, easier to breathe. Slowly, the light began to take shape, becoming more defined, until it formed the outline of a figure. She blinked, her eyes struggling to focus, but as the figure came into view, her heart skipped a beat. The man standing before her was familiar. He was the one who had called to her, the one who had appeared during her darkest hour. Jesus. But this time, he wasn't surrounded by darkness or foreboding. There was no terror in his gaze, no malevolent force in the air. Instead, he stood there, calm and steady, radiating warmth and peace. His eyes were filled with understanding, with compassion, and as Sarah looked at him, the turmoil inside her seemed to settle. "Sarah," he said, his voice soft, yet filled with an authority that sent a ripple of reassurance through her. "You have come through the fire. You have endured the darkness, and now, it is time to find the truth that lies ahead." Sarah's chest tightened with emotion as she stepped forward, her eyes brimming with tears. The weight of the journey, of the horror, and of the unknown that still loomed ahead, felt as though it had been lifted. I don't understand," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "What am I supposed to do? I've seen so much, heard so much. What is the truth?" Jesus smiled gently, and the kindness in his expression was like balm to her soul. "The truth is not for you to carry alone, Sarah. You have been shown the path. What happens next is in your hands, but you will not face it in darkness." He reached out, placing his hand on her shoulder, and in that moment, Sarah felt a warmth she had never known before, as though she were being enveloped in light. "You have a purpose, Sarah. You have seen the world for what it truly is, and now you must share that truth. You will help guide others through the same darkness you have walked. But you must first believe in yourself." Sarah closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, letting the peace wash over her. The fear, the confusion, the overwhelming weight of everything that had happened began to fade, replaced by a sense of clarity. She had been chosen for something, and now she had the strength to face it. When she opened her eyes again, the light surrounding her dimmed, but the presence of Jesus remained. "Go now, Sarah. The reckoning is not the end. It is a beginning. You are not alone. I am with you."